Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to leave it 20 seconds or so to let everyone join, and then we'll get going. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the second in our series of webinars on the current conflict in the Middle East, giving you key updates, analytical judgments, forecasting, and operational guidance. A bit of housekeeping first. If you missed last week's webinar, it's available via our Middle East hub, and we'll share the link in the chat if you want to see that initial longer briefing or any of the other published available advice and reports we have on the Middle East. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom. We've got some time at the end to answer audience questions. We're planning on talking for about 30 to 35 minutes, so we're keeping for a good chunk of time for your questions. And of course, we're closely monitoring the live situation and we'll run additional briefings as needed. At the moment, we've set a cadence of every Wednesday, but this is subject to change. We'll share details as and when we set up additional briefings, and they'll also be listed through the Middle East Hub. So joining us today, we have Rob Walker, again, current Director of Government Assistance at Helix and former infantry officer in the British Army for 14 years. And this week, we also have Ali Hassan, Associate Intelligence Analyst at Helix, and I'm Andrew Devereux, Global Risk Intelligence Manager. So without further ado, Ali, starting with you, could you give us a quick situational briefing on the key developments and updates that we've seen in the past week?
Absolutely, Andrew. I have a few developments to discuss, and this is indicative of just how rapidly and fluidly the conflict is evolving. For one thing, we've seen tit-for-tat strikes between Iran and the US-Israeli coalition continue over the past week. The US and Israel, in particular, have managed to inflict significant damage on Iran. They've managed to hit in key infrastructure sites such as the oil depots in Tehran. Iranian attacks have also continued, but they've slowed down as evidenced by not only our own observations, but the US military sources as well. Having said that, while Iranian attacks have slowed down, it doesn't mean that they're not ongoing or they don't continue to pose a risk. We have seen notable attacks, particularly in Bahrain. There was an attack in Bahrain hitting a commercial building yesterday, 10th March, which led to at least one casualty. In Israel, I have also noted that Iran and Hezbollah, which is operating from Lebanon, fire missile and rocket salvos towards the country on a near daily basis, particularly in central and northern Israel. The Middle East region, particularly countries near Iran, such as the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, remain implicated and affected by the ongoing conflict. But from an offensive point of view, they remain uninvolved. So that was military developments. As far as the operational snapshot goes, we've seen a slight improvement over the past week in that the airspaces of a few countries in the region have partially reopened. We've seen a partial reopening of the Emirati, Israeli, and Qatari airspaces. We've also seen regional airlines increasing the number of flights that they operate. So most of the Gulf GCC countries, national carriers have resumed operations, and they're flying whenever it is permissible to do so. At the same time, however, there has been significant deterioration in the Strait of Hormuz, where we've seen Iranian missile and drone activity consistently over the past week. The strait is effectively closed to global shipping, and since 20% of the world's crude oil passes through the strait, we are seeing a significant impact on the global economy as a result of that blockage. Furthermore, just today we learned that Iran has threatened to target banks and other US businesses with US government contracts in the GCC countries, and have warned people to stay away from without a 1 kilometer radius of those facilities. Finally, I want to share some political updates, and these are probably the most significant updates of the developments that have taken place. On Saturday, we saw Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian apologize to the GCC countries for Iranian attacks on them. Having said that, soon after, the conservative branch of the Iranian political elites rejected or rebuked his claim and suggested that attacks would continue. Furthermore, the Iranian Assembly of Experts, which determines who the supreme leader will be, has appointed a new supreme leader following the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. His son, Mujtaba Khamenei, has been appointed the supreme leader, and it's important to note that he is of a conservative bent. He's considered to be equally, if not more, hardline than his father, as evidenced by the fact that he was reportedly the head of the Basij militia, which is one of the militias within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. With respect to signals of when the war would end, we've seen quite a few mixed ones. On the one hand, U.S. President Trump said on Monday that the war was nearly complete. We His Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, almost contradicted him by stating in another interview that the war was just beginning. Israel's position is that it will continue fighting until it meets its objectives, while also adding the addendum that it does not seek a war that will last forever. And Iran has added that it will determine when the war ends, not the US or Israel. And that sums up the developments from the week.
Thank you very much, Ali. And I know we're going to go into a bit more detail on the military operations and the operational environment in a bit. But just to come in on the last point you made there about the slightly mixed messaging from the US in terms of their ultimate military objectives. One of the things we're going to be doing in these webinars going forwards is doing a focus section on one element of the conflict, each briefing. And this week we're focusing very much on the US military objectives, as these have been seen as being mixed and sometimes contradictory since the start of the conflict. And of course, these are essential to understand when trying to understand and assess potential end states for the war. So, Rob, could you give us an overview of your analysis of US military objectives?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And for that last slide, the first point I want to make is that if listeners aren't really sure exactly what the Trump administration wants to achieve in Iran or how you aren't alone, but I'd stress that that's a feature as much as it is a bug. And we talked last week about the way plans try to create shock to keep the enemy uncertain about what he needs to prepare for. Well, shock wears off. And the next best way to keep your enemy off balance is to create uncertainty. And that's where talk about regime change and even the reluctance to rule out boots on the ground comes in very useful. It's keeping the regime guessing about what threats it needs to prepare for. The second is that it's not unusual for aims in a conflict to evolve with time, and we should expect that here. Very few parties have the same goals at the end of a conflict that they started with. So shifting objectives don't necessarily mean failure, and plans evolve as the conditions change and what becomes feasible changes, so that the plans need to change with them. And a good example from last week was the way that the decapitation strike almost certainly killed some of the people that the US were considering as potential replacements if they were going for regime modification. And that will probably have caused some headaches for some of the people who are planning for that kind of activity after the conflict. But both those points presuppose that you've got a coherent strategy in the first place. And strategy is an exercise in identifying achievable objectives, developing plans that make use of the range of all of the sources of your power, so military, diplomatic, technological, and so forth, and then allocating the right resources to achieve them in the right order. And this is often referred to as ends, ways, and means, but a simpler way of looking at it might be intent and capability. This is what I want to do, this is what I have at my disposal, and this is how I intend to use it. So with that said, the US intent has been set out fairly clearly in terms of achieving specific limited objectives, including ending Iran's nuclear program, reducing its capabilities to threaten regional countries and global stability and so forth. And those are very much military objectives. They're appropriate for to be handed over to the military. And it's also important to note that most of the rhetoric surrounding regime change comes from the president himself and his advisors, and isn't really alluded to directly by the Department for War or the State Department. But there is an unspoken but heavily implied political intent from the US to signal to China through an overt demonstration of US military and intelligence power, and to establish or re-establish the US as an important power in the region after years of inattention. And although I'm entering into the realms of speculation here, there might also be a sense of unfinished business, not just from last year, but also going all the way back to 1979. Now, the US military intelligence technological capabilities are very clear. Its economic and diplomatic power is very significant, so it can ameliorate some of the economic impacts of the conflict. But it's not at the moment clear how the military objectives lead to the more maximal objective change. And there is also this added risk that if it doesn't clearly achieve the military goals, it's going to undermine the second order political strategic objectives regarding China. On the contrary, the Iranian regime's objectives are focused at the moment anyway, solely on regime survival, to hold the various branches of the security state together, to maintain the influence and reputation of the IRGC and its various branches regionally, and then also to militarily anyway preserve as much of its weapons arsenal as possible, probably covertly to continue developing its nuclear program, and also then retain the ability to make itself felt regionally. In terms of the execution of strategy, the best military plans anyway seek to pose a dilemma on the enemy, so to pose concurrent problems that compound each other. And at the lowest level, that can be something as simple as, you can take cover in a trench if someone's shooting at you, but if someone is crawling to you with a grenade to post it into your trench while someone's shooting at you, you suddenly got a decision to make. You've either got to stick your head out and shoot at the person, in which case you might get shot by the other person, or you stay there and get blown up by the grenade. Now, on the strategic level, you can't fight a two-front war with an army that's designed to fight on only one front. So the problem here is that an air campaign on its own doesn't really pose a dilemma. It presents the enemy with a problem, but it's one that he can adapt to at relatively limited cost. And we've seen repeatedly in recent years that intelligent opponents respond to air campaigns by dispersing and hiding their capabilities, using deception, and retaining enough capability to remain a nuisance at best, and at worst, a persistent threat. And the Houthis in Yemen are an obvious example of that. And similarly, in 1999, the Serbs in Kosovo took a similar approach. And it's really only the threat from a ground force that creates a dilemma. So if you disperse or hide your missiles or whatever, they become hard to attack from the air. But if there are ground forces available, you can't use them then to respond to the ground force. And if you do expose them, then the Air Force potentially blows them up. Now, that doesn't appear to be the case here. And although ground troops haven't been ruled out, the possibility of any kind of decisive ground intervention at the moment looks quite remote. And another really important dimension of strategy is having the ability to measure success objectively and knowing when you're achieving for example, your military end state, so you can then transition to political developments. It's clear Iran's military capabilities are being degraded, but it's very difficult at this stage to know by how much. And it's also hard to assess progress when there's no agreed definition of what that success looks like, at least publicly available. Now, that's hard even for the US with its intelligence capabilities. The assessments have to be made based on overhead imagery. It's very difficult to do that accurately when the targets are underground or hardened. And when it comes to human targets, they can make behavioral modifications. A good example is the strikes on Iran's nuclear program last year, which initially were heralded as having been obliterated, and then the more sober assessments a couple of weeks later concluded that it might have simply been set back by up to best case 2 years. And that had a relatively low analytical confidence as well. And US objectives in Iran aren't easily or objectively measured because they rely on uncertain estimates of Iran's existing capability. And really importantly, it's very difficult to verify them because there's no one on the ground, even international observers. So how do you know when you've destroyed enough missile launchers, let alone all of them? And that takes us into one of the other dangers of an air-only campaign anyway, which is sometimes referred to as the escalation trap. So far, I think we can all agree that the US has achieved very impressive tactical effects. It's destroyed an awful lot of kit. It's done it very overtly. But that hasn't translated apparently yet into any change in regime will. And so we're not seeing defections, a lot of people being killed, but we're not seeing the regime collapsing. We're not seeing defections. There are no defections of military units and so forth. And Iran is still firing missiles, albeit at a lower rate than on the first couple of days. But that's, I think, to be expected. And so as a result of that, these air campaigns often develop their own internal logic where they, having achieved those effects, the tactical effects, there's still no political effect. And so they widen the target set. They go after targets of potentially diminishing importance, and then the law of diminishing returns sets in. So more expenditure, more use of weapons for less and less effect. And that makes, there's a kind of a sunk cost issue here as well, because it makes it harder for you then to exit the campaign, and it's very difficult for you to quantify what you've done. And in some ways, your superficially spectacular effects start to actually look like a sign of impotence. You're bombing all of these things, but you're still not achieving your goals. And on that point, in terms of the outlook, first of all, no one's seen anything of the new supreme leader apart from, I think, a cardboard cutout at one point. This is obviously, I would say, an indication that the regime is adapting to what has happened. It's changing its behavior. They're probably not going anywhere near cell phones or pagers at the moment. They're all in hiding. They've gone to they're using their massively decentralized command structures as the sort of the nodes are taken out, and that sounds like it's a success, but it's only a success if you're trying to impede them from making decisions. And there aren't really that many new decisions for them to deal with at this stage. So they're not looking at ground forces. They're really just managing. This is not posing a dilemma to the regime. So it can just go into hiding, and it can just put its kit into hiding as well. And so ultimately, the best and probably the only objective evidence of US success is some kind of prolonged period where Iran is not using its missile stockpile to intimidate its neighbors. And that's receding the initiative to Iran, because it's you're trying to prove a negative. We've been successful, and the only sign of that is that Iran isn't doing anything. So for that reason, I think that the conflict's got a little way to go yet, and certainly everyone on this webinar, including us, need to be prepared for a longer war, potentially characterized by peaks and troughs, as the air war scales back when it's running out of targets. A lull, and then Iran tries to do something to show that it's not out of the fight, and then the US or Israel respond. And I suppose the concern is that this starts to look a little bit like a kind of a macro version of the mowing the grass approach, which Israel tried with mixed results to apply to Gaza, but extended over a much more geographically important area and with significant and much more global consequences. The big caveat for all of this is, as usual, what we're looking at is publicly available information. What we're seeing on TV is a tiny fraction of what's actually going on, and a huge amount of this of the activity at the strategic and even at the military level is being conducted through diplomatic back channels. So that is a huge caveat. But based on what we can see at the moment and divine, I would suggest we all need to prepare for at least for a couple more weeks yet.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob. Lots and lots to digest in there, very comprehensive. I mean, the point you made there that both targets and missiles are finite. So if the US military objectives claim that degrading ballistic missile systems was an ultimate victory, then Iran probably has time afterwards to just create and build more production. We'll start again.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I think certainly based on my reading, the bottleneck as far as ballistic missiles are concerned is the launcher, the mobile launchers. And so there was a concerted effort last year to go after those mobile launchers. But even based on the IDF's publicly available estimates, it suggests either they underestimated how many launches they had last year, or they've managed to regenerate. We're basically talking about trucks with things on the back of
Sure,
them
yeah.
to carry the missiles. And they've been able to regenerate some of that relatively quickly, which does suggest that this could be something of a longer conflict if the Iranians do indeed choose to make it longer.
Sure, thank you, Rob. So, calculated ambiguity is what we're going for at the moment. So, just to come back to you, Ali. Last week, Alice unpacked three key analytical judgments related to the conflict. Could you do similar this week and give us three areas we're focusing on, which are sort of crucial to understanding the potential impacts of this conflict?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. I'll talk about security environment trends, security risk trends, then discuss the operational environment, followed by an assessment of so to add to what Rob said about potential timelines and what we're looking at and what we should be preparing for. So, in as far as the security risk trends go, by virtue of the fact that the tit for tat strikes between Iran and the US Israeli coalition continue, despite a decrease in Iranian strikes relative to the week before, security risk trends remain deteriorating. The reason for this is simply because the countries in the countries of the region, particularly the GCC countries, to begin with, had baseline risk levels of low or moderate overall risks. So, by virtue of the fact that this conflict is ongoing and it's still impacting them, the overall risk trend remains deteriorating despite a slight improvement from where things were a week before. At the same time, though, I should note that there has been a slight improvement in the aviation operating environment relative to last week, and this is, I think, particularly pertinent for those who are joining us today, because many are concerned about whether the people they know, personnel, family members, will be able to travel either via the region, or if they're in the region, then out of the region. And we're increasingly seeing that flights are becoming more operational. Airports are operating sporadically. Airspaces are opening up sporadically, and there are increasingly larger windows in which people can fly out of the region should they choose to do so. And of course, the as far as land borders go in the GCC, the land borders remain permissible. So should someone wish to travel from, say, the UAE to Oman or Saudi Arabia, it remains an option, and Saudi Arabia and Oman still remain relatively unscathed to the other GCC countries. With and this is largely due All of this is largely due to the fact that Iranian attacks have slowed down over the past week, similar to what and going back to what Rob said, and likely because their arsenal is deteriorating, certainly of ballistic missiles. Their drone capabilities, we know, are some if not infinite, then certainly close to infinite, in that they can continue to manufacture drones and fly them out at little cost. So they can continue to wage conflict via their drone capabilities. But we do know that their missile arsenal, their missile arsenal, is depleting over time. With respect to where the war is headed, I'll keep it to assessments and not forecasts, but I just want to highlight what's been said and what we can make of the some statements that have been put out recently with respect to timelines. So I mentioned earlier that the US said the US administration said that the war would end is close to completion, but then also said that the war was just beginning. And this, as Rob said, this may be deliberate. Strategic goals may be deliberately obfuscated, but at the same time, by virtue of them being obfuscated, be it deliberately or just by accident, this has contributed to confusion, which is why time frames have become vague, and we can't rely on statements being put out by U.S. Authorities to determine when the conflict will end. However, at the same time, it is important to note that Iran has made some choices to indicate where it stands with respect to the conflict. By appointing Mujtaba Khamenei, it is basically indicated that it is continuing it is continuing its positions and its strategy in this conflict. Wh- while less militarily capable, Iran is relying on resolve within the government and its strategic geographical location to keep the war going. And the appointment of a conservative leader it is indicative of the fact that it's doubling down. Important to mention about Mujtaba Khamenei, he was, of course, leader of the Besieged, but he also, according to very credible reports, was involved in the alleged rigging of the 2009 Iranian presidential election, which led to the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad over a very popular reformist candidate, Mir Hussein Mousavi, indicating that he very much sides with the establishment, that his father was, of course, the head of for 40 years, and we're not seeing a deviation from there. And by virtue of his appointment, it also means that the opportunities for mediation are few and far between. Trump has already rejected Khamenei's appointment, and Trump has also said that no Iranian appointment, supreme leader appointment, should be made without the US's approval, or rather, the United States has indicated that it wants a say in who will lead Iran. Since Iran has made this appointment without the United States' approval, this is likely to widen the gap between the two countries. Israel is of course committed to ensuring that Iran is never a threat to it in the near or medium term. And so all three actors are basically the US and Israel are at loggerheads with Iran, and we're not. What I'm trying to say with all of this is it's important to consider that the conflict may not end within the near term and to plan accordingly.
Thank you very much, Ali. I mean, ending on a note there, which very much echoes Rob's statement in terms of the sort of conflict timeline that we can expect. We're now going to move on to looking at some of the indicators and forecasting that we covered last week. And this is the same slide as we saw last week, just with a bit of an update to the current status. Now, some of this we've sort of already covered, so I won't go into too much detail, such as the aerospace threats. Although this has improved due to the tempo and volume of Iranian projectile fire slowing, we're still saying it's an indicator of deterioration because of that baseline that we're comparing it against. The Gulf countries are still continuing to intercept projectiles on a daily basis. Even today, we saw a drone attack on Dubai International Airport that caused some injuries. And in terms of airspace and air travel availability, we're also saying this is deteriorating, even though airspace has gradually reopened and commercial services have resumed with limited availability. There is still a huge amount of cancellations and backlogs which need to be dealt with before there's any sort of return to a normal service or indicators of improvement. Border operations, as Ali mentioned, these are largely stable. There can be busier periods during the height of the day, but cross-border transit is generally operating. In terms of positive diplomatic signals, we haven't seen any in the past week. The US, Israel, or Iran have not indicated a desire for negotiations, and actually the political developments that we've seen means that this is probably deteriorated further. In terms of critical infrastructure, we're still saying that this is showing indicators of improvement. There's been limited reports of power utility or communications outages due to the missile salvos from Iran, despite the fact these are clearly within the targeting pattern and modus operandi of the Iranian military. And similar with cyber threats, there have been limited reports of successful cyber attacks. There have been reports of attempted cyber attacks, but these have had limited impact on the overall trajectory of the war. And we've also not seen too many accounts of successful methods of hybrid warfare. In terms of government regulations, we're saying there's indicators of improvement here because in GCC countries, there are directives advising those in country to subscribe to emergency alerts and prioritize safety. But generally, there's no mandated safety measures. These are more prescriptive to allow for enhanced safety measures if in those countries. And in terms of travel advisories and embassy footprints, we're still saying there's indicators of deterioration here. The majority of travel advisories for the Middle East from Western nations advise against all travel at the moment, or to the need to reconsider any non-essential travel. And in terms of the embassy footprint, the US, UK, and other Western nations are continuing to order more embassy staff or diplomats to leave the region if they haven't already. So moving on to some forecasting for the next few days and weeks. In terms of military operations, we're saying the sustained reciprocal military operations are highly likely to continue for at least 3 weeks, probably with the lens that could be extended if we don't see any indicators of a cessation of conflict in the next week or so. So we maintain this due to many of the reasons that Ali and Rob have mentioned before. The US administration is claiming huge progress is being made with targeting the Iranian military, navy and ballistic capabilities. As we mentioned, this is hard to fully validate because of the challenging information environment within Iran, but this appears to be their current focus. This current cadence of air operations between all involved parties that we're seeing is unlikely to be broken. There has been a decline in tempo and volume of missile and drone strikes, but Iran today announced its 35th wave of operations today. The number of missiles and drones in each salvo has declined. As we mentioned last week, these are finite resources. There is still some low-level drone damage and injuries, and these can be expected to continue. The IRGC, as mentioned, they have stated they will decide when the war will end. The US has stated their military goals are being achieved, maybe signaling they're moving towards trying to suggest an off-ramp, but we're not quite there yet. One thing I think we're going to keep a close eye on the next week is the rhetoric around the Strait of Hormuz. There's clear leverage there that the Iranians could use by targeting vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Trump's rhetoric about the Strait of Hormuz is incredibly bellicose as well about potential repercussions, and because of the potential global impacts of that could be a real focus going forward. In terms of the regional travel disruption, as we've already mentioned, airports and air operations remain highly disrupted, and they're highly likely to remain highly disrupted in the current week. We've seen major challenges in Bahrain, Israel, Qatar, UAE. Operations are sort of tentatively reopening. There's a partial reopening of the space. It's a very cautious approach that some airlines are taking. There's still major backlogs due to volume of passengers, and there's been a limited number of state-sponsored evacuation flights, but the official stance still remains to leave via commercial means wherever possible. In terms of the conflict cessation, we say that this is basically a diplomatic end to the conflict is now highly unlikely. We said this was unlikely last week, highly unlikely this week in the short term, owing to the election of the new supreme leader. As Rob outlined during his section on US military objectives, it's quite unclear what the US is looking for a conclusion of this conflict. What does mission success look like to them? We've seen some of the contradictory rhetoric from Hesketh and the president, whether that's deliberate or not. Again, up for speculation. And with Khamenei's son, a hardline conservative, taking power as supreme leader, this looks less like a conciliatory move, more like one of confrontation. I think it shouldn't be forgotten that Khamenei's wife and other family members were killed at the start of the conflict in the strikes that killed his father, and he wants to preserve the system. As mentioned last week, this is an existential crisis for the Iranian elites, and the Iran and the Iranian government has a much higher threshold for pain than the US. They will endure in order to try and preserve the system that has benefited them for many years. In terms of regional spillover, proxy groups remain involved and active, and this is highly likely to continue. Cyprus have accused Hezbollah of being behind the drone strike, which hit the RAF Akrotiri base in Cyprus. This shows that they are prepared to undertake offensive operations, but at the same time, they're currently involved in a proto-proxy war over its southern border with Israel, so it's unlikely to be significantly involved with more regional actions. And in terms of the general international community, even though countries such as Cyprus, Turkey, Azerbaijan have been targeted. No other countries are yet to commit to offensive operations, and we think that it's unlikely that further international military intervention is going to occur. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has urged US and Israel to end the war due to the risk of further escalation, and this pretty much echoes what we're seeing from the EU and the UN at the moment, calls for restraint and diplomacy. And lastly, in terms of the political trajectory, regime change in Iran is now highly unlikely, and this is down from unlikely last week, owing to the consolidation of power by the Iranian political and military elites. With Khamenei taking over as supreme leader, this demonstrates that the political elites are choosing confrontation over compromise. The IRGC are becoming increasingly emboldened, and the key power brokers, the domestic power brokers, are committing to ensuring the continuation of the Islamic Republic rather than attempting to find a pacifying ground. US attempts to encourage either Kurdish domestic elements to attempt to take power or using their attacks to try and encourage the election of a more moderate supreme leader look to have failed in the short term. It's not to say that they could be revisited. And also, it needs to be remembered that it remains credible that Khamenei Jr.'s reign will be short. There's already been rumours that he's been injured, despite the fact he's not been seen or public or his location isn't currently known. Really, it depends whether the intelligence structures that either Israel or the US have active in Tehran remain active, and if they're able to target Khamenei in a similar sort of strike that killed his father just over a week ago. So that's our current forecasting. And next, we're just going to move back to you, Rob. Obviously, as a conflict evolves, so does our operational guidance. So, could you give us a bit of an update on the guidance we're currently recommending for businesses and individuals?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Actually, the the advice remains broadly the same as it is, the same as we briefed last week. So the general advice about following trusted information sources remains. The need for flexibility absolutely remains. In terms of our advice to decision makers, I would just stress the importance of contingency planning. So making sure that you are thinking ahead for how a potentially more protracted conflict could affect business continuity, and then also the need for or the value of after action reviews, even decisions that you've made over the last 10 days to evaluate them properly and see what you can do differently in the future, not just in relation to this crisis, but also for future crises as well. In terms of the advice of people still in the region, I would, that final bullet there about avoiding potential targets, I do think there's a possibility that Iran attempts to escalate further horizontally, as they say, by engaging critical infrastructure as well as military bases. So not just the energy sector, but also potentially desalination plants and places like that. So just stay abreast of what the current likely targets are and make sure that your people are avoiding them as far as possible, and if they've got no choice but to be near them, to minimize the time that they are spending around them. That's it, really. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the operational advice and guidance at this stage of the conflict still remains of vital importance. So we're now going to move on to some questions. So the first one that's come in, good question actually. So it's Al-Quds Day this Sunday, and given the history rooted in Iran, is it feasible or reasonable to anticipate some kind of statement, move, or action from Iran? I think this is looking at the sort of the historic status and symbol of that day. I'll let either of you take that, despite the fact that neither of you have immediately gone off mute. But
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I
sure,
mean,
thank you, Ali.
yeah, certainly possible. I wouldn't put my money on something significant happening already. I doubt Iran's ability to significantly escalate beyond where we already are. I mean, if the decrease in attacks is indicative of anything, it's that Iran's military capabilities are decreasing, and therefore, irrespective of whether a symbolic day there is a symbolic time or not, It's just a question of capabilities at a certain point. Will it be capable of escalating? And my answer to that, and Rob, please feel free to disagree if you think otherwise, but my answer to that would be no. I'm not holding my breath on Al Quds Day.
Yeah, I mean, I simply don't know enough about Iranian politics to comment, but I would say that it seems like the kind of thing that the people conducting military operations might well be looking for if they do attempt to do it, they're looking for an opportunity to make a point. Um, so if Iran does try to do something, it's an opportunity to gather information about where they're doing it, and then also potentially to strike, which we know that they can do, very quickly. So if they try something, I would be skeptical of its chances of success.
Sure. And just to add to that, in terms of potential secondary risks, for instance, I've seen that there was a Quds Day march organised in London, for instance, and that's been made illegal by banned by the Home Secretary. So there are some secondary risks here of potential protest activity and counter protest activity in Western cities on Sunday as well, especially if countries in Europe as well also ban such protests. They can't ban static protests in the UK, for instance, so it's highly likely there's going to be some sort of event held. And if there is controversial, the circumstances during those events, I believe at previous protests in previous years, there's been suggestions of the burning of Israeli flags, or there's been Hezbollah flags and that sort of thing. So if there are those sort of activities, there's obviously secondary risks to those in the area if there's any clashes between protesters, counter-protesters, and the police. So generally, Al Quds Day on Sunday could be a pretty politically charged day if there are any events. Another question here. Do you think there is a threat of the use of chemical weapons by Iran, or indeed a more high-spec missile type that they've held back in reserve?
The answer to the second, I'm happy to answer this question. To the second part, I would say it's entirely possible. We can't rule it out. But to your question about chemical weapons, I think the use of chemical weapons would be extremely escalatory as opposed to a meaningful deterrent. It would make sense for Iran to use chemical weapons if it were to deter further military action, but I suspect the use of chemical weapons would be a red line that would invite retaliation, significant retaliation, not just from the United States and Israel, but may also lead European countries and other global North countries to reconsider their current position of military neutrality in the war.
Sure. And I mean, what this question could be expanded out to, what are some of these sort of escalatory paths that we're not seeing at the moment that all parties could potentially go down? So not just chemical weapons, high spec missile types. I mean, I mentioned this in the office earlier, like the US administration hasn't taken anything off the table. So even boots on the ground, or even a rapid commando strike, if we're talking about rapid boots on the ground, an in-out sort of operation targeting a nuclear facility, targeting individuals on the ground. I think the important thing here to state is that we can't be hampered by a failure of imagination when it comes to these sort of things. We don't want to get hooked or anchored by our own cognitive biases, saying that something is more or less likely because we do or don't want it to happen, which is obviously the sort of basic intelligence analyst 101 sort of stuff there. But I think that's important to remember with this sort of question. So I think we've probably got time for one more. And I think, Rob, this is probably right up your street. How much involvement do you believe China and Russia will have, considering the reported close ties with Iran, and will this lead to an end of the war?
Um, well, I only know what I read in the newspapers as well. So there's plenty of speculation about the extent to which Russia is providing um, targeting support, intelligence support, and so forth. And I mean, it certainly makes sense to me, but unfortunately, I don't have any insight into the nature of those. I mean, it would be surprising if it weren't happening, I suppose, is the way I put it. But the exact extent and the nature of the cooperation, I think, is is entirely uncertain. And similarly for China, I mean, it would be extraordinary if China weren't watching very closely and
Mm.
providing a deniable level of support, even if they're not overt. But I think, Ali, to your point earlier about the use of chemical weapons, I think there'd be a lot of pressure on both China and Russia to unequivocally condemn anything like that. And now, I mean, Iran might just figure, I suppose, that it's got nothing to lose and do it anyway. But I think it would definitely cross somebody's red lines. And while they might not be worried about what Germany or France can contribute militarily compared with what's been thrown at them already, I think it would have potentially would have an impact on their relationships with Russia and China. If
Sure,
that
thank
makes
you, Rob. And I'm just going to chuck in one more quick one, probably for you, Ali. Does India have the capability or will to facilitate peace talks between Israel and Iran?
I I think the countries that have the capability to facilitate peace talks between Israel and Iran are the countries that are implicated in this conflict already. So the US and GCC countries. I mean, Qatar at this point is a negotiator for many global conflicts, and the negotiations between the United States and Iran over basically the Iran's nuclear facilities and nuclear capabilities were happening in Muscat and Oman. These countries are unlike the United States is, as I mentioned earlier, not interested in negotiations anymore. But it seems unlikely at this point that the GCC countries would have would be able to facilitate negotiations where they already tried and were not successful. I don't see any third party country, irrespective of its relations with either Israel or Iran, coming in and being able to broker any agreement. And also important to mention, I don't foresee any scenario in which Israel and Iran would see eye to eye on their key differences. They're so diametrically at odds with each other that Iran and the US would still be something a realistic scenario. Israel and Iran are unlikely to see eye to eye, at least while they remain on their current political trajectories.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if either one or a few countries try and set up some sort of international coalition of mediation or something to try and get them to the table. What that might look like, whether that be India or other countries that have recently been quite good at basically not hitching their wagon to one of the international superpowers. So India, Turkey, Egypt immediately come to mind, who are trying to be a bit more neutral and trying to harbour good relationships with Russia, China, Iran, the US, Europe at the moment. So, and as you say, some of the key mediators recently, mainly the GCC countries, are already embroiled in the conflict. So it'll be interesting to see sort of how that develops as the conflict goes on. So that's all the questions we've got time for today. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much, Rob and Ali, for your insights. As mentioned at the start, the recording of this webinar will be available. It'll be sent out for you. Please share it as widely as you would like. And communication regarding any other further briefings either next Wednesday or at another point will either be sent out or will be available via the Middle East Hub. Thank you very much for joining us today.